Speaker, I rise today in support of my bill, H.R. 1191, Protecting Volunteer Firefighters and Emergency Responders Act. I had hoped that by now we would not have to be on the floor of this body talking about my legislation once again. This is the third time I have brought this bill to the floor of the House. It is intended to protect volunteer firefighters and emergency service personnel from Obamacare. The first two times I introduced it, it passed the House by a combined vote of 811 to 0. I know that there are very few pieces of legislation that attract such amazing bipartisan support, and for that, I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Today, I come asking for your support again. Let me tell you why this bill is necessary. In 2013, a firefighter from back home named Bob Timko approached me at a parade in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. He told me about a serious problem regarding volunteer firefighters and the Affordable Care Act, or ACA. Because the Internal Revenue Services specifically considered volunteer firefighters employees for federal tax purposes, there was the fear that they would fall under the employer mandate of the ACA. If volunteer fire companies were subject to the employer mandate, they could be liable for crippling new health care costs, causing many to have to close their doors. Mr. Speaker, as we all know, the threshold for the employer mandate is 50 employees. That raised the question of how volunteer firefighters would be counted. Would they be counted as employees just under the company, or would they be counted as municipal employees? If that were the case, many volunteer fire companies could easily achieve 50 employees. If they did, these companies could be forced to pay health insurance costs for their volunteers or pay a fine. This is very important in my home state of Pennsylvania. 97% of our fire companies depend either mostly or entirely on volunteers. And across the country, 87% of fire companies depend on volunteers. Now, as a former mayor, I can tell you that volunteer firefighters are part of the essential fabric of our communities. These are people who risk their lives every day to protect their friends, families, and people they don't even know. And I can tell you that no one becomes a volunteer firefighter because they want health insurance. And while they are on duty, they are, of course, covered by workmen's compensation insurance. Our volunteer firefighters have a hard enough time raising money needed for basic equipment. They cannot afford to pay for health insurance or pay a fine on top of it. Last year, the IRS finally decided, after months of pressure from members of this House, from firefighters, and from the media, that they will not consider volunteer firefighters employees for federal tax purposes. But I don't think we should leave something as important as public safety in the hands of unelected bureaucrats at the IRS. Our brave volunteer emergency personnel deserve certainty. As I said, this is the third time we have had this bill before this body. The first time in 2014, it passed the House of Representatives 410 to nothing. When it got to the Senate, they used it to attach unrelated language about emergency unemployment insurance. The bill died. The second time, just earlier this year, it passed the House of Representatives 401 to nothing. This time, the Senate stripped all of my language out of the bill. It got turned into a one-week funding measure for the Department of Homeland Security. This is a bill that deserves to become law. This legislation has the strong support of the National Volunteer Fire Council, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and the Congressional Fire Services Institute. I appreciate their support and the work of all the men and women they represent who protect us every day in our hometowns. We all agree that public safety is too important of an issue to play politics with. Mr. Speaker, I urge passage of this bill, and I ask all members to vote yes. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time.